This is the conversation with Justin Clarke-Doane. He's a professor of philosophy at Columbia University, where he explores the philosophy of mathematics or the foundations of mathematics, along with metaethics, metaphilosophy, and analytic philosophy. He's the author of 2 books, Morality and Mathematics and Mathematics and Metaphilosophy. In this conversation, we discuss the importance of the foundations of mathematics, whether mathematical axioms and proofs are real and objective, and whether you can extend that same logic to ethics and morality, whether morality is subjective, or you can have objective axioms and proofs of morality. We also talk about the introduction of AI in mathematics, and we finally solve the age-old question, does 2 + 2 = 4? The answer will surprise you. This is no time. If you like what you see, then do hit subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, or rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. This project takes a lot of my time, money, and effort. So if you'd like to see it continue, do consider making a donation on Patreon, Anchor. You can join on YouTube. You can leave a gift on Reels. If not through monetary channels, then do consider sharing these episodes, leaving your likes and comments. All forms of engagement, they really go a long way. For other forms of love and support, you can follow this channel on Instagram or Twitter, or follow me personally. And now, it's no time. Nagarjuna had once said, since all is empty, all is possible. In your first year of undergrad, you found your self-professed first love, which was classical Indian and Buddhist philosophy. So let's rewind the clock. Let's go back in time. Take me back to your freshman year at the New College of Florida. What was it about Nagarjuna, the Madhyamaka tradition, Shunyata, and classical Indian and Buddhist philosophy in general that made you fall head over heels?
You got to first keep in mind that college for me was sort of a mind-blowing experience. I was not on an academic track, you might say, before college. And so I got there really just eyes wide open, didn't know what I was going to do, but had acquired a little bit of interest in Indian philosophy as a result of one chance event, which was that my grandfather, he was a Unitarian minister. And so it was sort of the closest thing to an intellectual I knew. And he, I guess, you know, he had enough with he wasn't going to read them again. He had a collection of books on Indian philosophy, or not Indian philosophy, on Indian really religious thought primarily, and as well as just books on Buddhism more generally. And I read, it's probably the only book I think I read cover to cover before college. And it was The 3 Pillars of Zen, which of course is not Indian philosophy, it's Japanese philosophy, comes from China, but originally the idea comes from India. And that stuck with me somehow. So when I got to college, I was like, you know, if there's anything at all related to that, I'd like to take it. And I went to a really small college with no grades and no requirements and stuff like that. And so it's the kind of place where there's a lot of self-study, and you often take courses on idiosyncratic topics, because there's just a relatively small collection of people. So there was one guy who happened to be a Buddhologist, and that sort of was the guy who represented all of, you know, Asian everything. Yeah. So I just took everything with him because I was really fascinated. And why, to the question of why I was fascinated. So I think this is before I knew anything about Western philosophy or philosophy under that heading. And what I liked about the stuff I was reading, especially in the Indian tradition, and not just, by the way, the Madhyamaka tradition, I was interested in what, you know, there's 2 schools of Buddhist philosophy, actually 3 schools, but the main schools being Theravada and Mahayana, and I was also interested in the schools of Theravada tradition, the Theravada tradition. But what struck me about them was there was a rigor to the thinking, but at the same time, they were talking about stuff that seemed to matter to me. And I had no exposure, as I said, to things like Aristotle or Plato or anything, but my vague, I think, sense in the back of my head was that that stuff was kind of word games about stuff that I don't care very much about. And of course, that's, you know, it's like a high school student reaction to something. But I must say that to this day, I mean, I don't read Sanskrit and I don't read Pali, but long term, I do hope to learn these languages as sort of a hobby. But to this day, I maintain a lay interest in that stuff, and I continue to love how they always seem to keep their finger on the sort of the relevant questions. And
what are the relevant questions?
Well, they're questions like, you know, what's the source of suffering? What is the nature of the mind and the self? What's the nature of external reality?
Easy questions.
Right. Easy questions. Exactly. Like, right. So you might absolutely think that their answers are systematically wrong, but you got to give them credit for staying focused on those kinds of questions where there's a temptation, I think, always in philosophy. This is something Thomas Nagel says, to make it easier than it is. And I think what he means by that is, you know, sort of change the subject to something that you can resolve. So, and by resolve, I mean kind of as a matter of poll numbers, get everybody to agree that this is the answer to the problem. So, you know, you analyze a word, like, you know, what does the word knowledge mean in English? Mm-hmm. And I don't want to at all disparage that project because it has import and it is maybe solvable, but you might think that that's somehow a distillation or a sort of superficial ripoff of what we were originally trying to do in, you know, the dialogues. So anyway, the answer to your question is people like Nagarjuna impressed me for the combination of their rigor, but also their focus. They spoke to things that I cared about just as a human being. And I think everyone does if they actually spend the time to expose themselves to that stuff. You know, they might decide, oh, well, that's too hard, I'm going to do something else. But it's hard not to be shaken by the questions.
Even though you were shaken by those questions and that was your first love,
mm-hmm.
and you found Aristotle and Plato as wordplay,
yeah,
at some point you started getting sucked into the world of Western philosophy, in quotes, and then analytic philosophy and logic, mm-hmm. and the foundations of mathematics. Mm-hmm. Bertrand Russell had once said that men fear thought as they fear nothing else on earth, more than ruin, more even than death. Thought is subversive and revolutionary, destructive and terrible. Thought is merciless to privilege, established institutions, and comfortable habits. Thought is anarchic and lawless, indifferent to authority, careless to the well-tried wisdom of the ages. Thought looks into the pit of hell and is not afraid. Thought is great and swift and free, the light of the world and the chief glory of man. A lot of the work that you do in the foundations of mathematics and logic and analytic philosophy is around thought and questioning the assumptions that we hold true. What are these axioms that we have taken for granted in mathematics, and what are the axioms we can take for granted in morality? Before we dive into the specifics of your work, can you comment on the importance of working in the foundations of mathematics? Why is it important to question these assumptions, break them down, and identify the true nature of them?
Right. So let me just first of all connect the first topic to the second. So it's not that I studied Indian philosophy and was like, this is great, but I like the Western stuff even better, so I'm going to switch topics. It's again really, it's just very mundane. I was at a small school. There was no one who taught Indian philosophy. So there was this Buddhologist. I took every course he had. And so there was nothing left to take. And I didn't even, so I found myself trying to take the questions they were asking seriously, kind of on my own. And I was meanwhile studying math. So the only thing sort of to do was to see if I could sort of turn it into a math problem, which is so cheesy now when I think about it. But I mean, you know, I didn't know how to approach these questions. And somebody said, you know, you really should talk to the analytic philosopher. There was one analytic philosopher, Aaron Edidin. And so that's why I started taking analytic philosophy. And
you wrote a proof for him that time has no beginning or end just to get into his class.
I guess that, yeah, well, actually, right. But I never showed it to him, thank God. But yeah, I mean, right. So I took his metaphysics class, and metaphysics, Western metaphysics does overlap substantially with classical Indian philosophy. So there's some of it I felt annoyed with, some of it though spoke to me in the same ways. Anyway, so the, how did I move specifically into foundations of math? Again, the initial answer is mundane, but there is, I think, a post facto justification for why I've stuck with it. The original answer is I was majoring in philosophy and math, and I got into philosophy late, and also this analytic philosopher was on sabbatical for part of the time, and so it was just hard to get in all the requirements. And so there were two options. One was to write 2 theses, and the theses at New College, I don't know how it is today, but at the time they were not like 30-page papers; they were like dissertations. Yeah. And meanwhile, I had to get all these requirements in my last year, so I thought, okay, probably better to write something that passes both muster in the math department and the philosophy department, but I didn't know anything about anything that did that. So I tried to learn philosophy of math as much as I could and make a contribution sufficient to get. So that's how I got into the subject and became acquainted with it. Okay. So why though didn't I decide, okay, well, done with that, now on to other things, because that was a pain. Well, here's why, because it turns out, in my view, that math specifically in its the subdiscipline of, it's both math, philosophy, computer science, it overlaps, but mathematical logic and the foundations of math, which is this this really Baroque field. I mean, there's very, if you were to like count the number of people who are employed in, tenured positions doing it, it's very low, because it's, I think many people have the feeling like, who cares? And I think that's because most people don't know where it comes from. I mean, the short story about that is computer science and your iPhone comes from the study of the foundations of math. It comes from Frege asking the most metaphysical question you could ask: what is the number 2? Yeah. And trying to answer that in a serious way. But my view is that the foundations of math, it's not just about math. It's about knowledge and what it means to establish a claim from another claim. So it's easy to think that, you should be interested in philosophy of math if you really care about math. And some people care about math and some people find it very boring. And I understand that. The foundations of math, though, is not primarily about math. It's primarily about what it means to argue, to make a rigorous argument, to establish something, what it means to take something for granted, and when you can do that, what it means to make an inferential transition from one claim to another that is without gaps, which is somehow, there's nothing to question. Like all bachelor, all bachelors are unmarried. Joe's a bachelor, so Joe's unmarried. The traditional thought is that, that you might disagree with the premises, but you got to grant me the transition from the premises to the conclusion. So it's about that. And of course, that question permeates all reasoning. That question is something we need to ask when we think about politics, when we think about ethics, when we think about the fundamentals of physics, when we think about aesthetics. Reasoning is one of the few rules that seems to cross-cut all disciplines. So foundations of math is not really about, functions and sets and metric tensors and so forth. It's primarily about this question, in my view, that permeates just all of human thought. So that's how I got stuck on it. And that's how I started to worry about it, because I decided that actually the kind of, again, there's not many people who study it, so it's sort of a weird way to put it, but the view on the street about the foundations of math, I think, is too simple. And in a sense, the project, I think, that people like Frege and Russell were trying to carry through, and to his credit, I think Russell, towards the end of his career, would have agreed with this, but can't be achieved.
You've opened up a few doors for me, so I'm going to start quickly walking through all of them.
Yeah.
The first one where you mentioned initially in your answer was about the links between philosophy and mathematics, how you try to merge the two. you're not the first person to
Right.
try and create these links. I think Plato was the earliest advocate for the strong links between mathematics and ethics.
That's right.
But I'm going to go on a limb here and say most of the world disagrees with Plato. I'm putting my career on the line.
Yeah.
But if you walk down on the street today, you pick out a random person, you were talking about like just the off the street assumption. I'm going to go as far as saying that if you ask someone on the street whether 1 + 1 is 2 or whether prime numbers exist, they're going to say maths is universal, it's absolute, not up for debate. But if you were to ask them the question about morality, then it would be, it's subjective, it depends, what are your assumptions? I don't have the poll numbers, but I'm going to say that most of the world believes that math is realist and objective, and morality is anti-realist and subjective.
Right.
Do you agree? In fact, I know you don't agree. So why do you disagree with this? And can you make the case that math is also anti-realist and subjective?
Yeah. I mean, so first of all, we just gotta, these terms are, you know, they're technical terms that you can, there's a million ways to define them. So yeah, let's just, for purposes of clarity, define the word realism about an area to mean that there are truths about the area and they don't depend on us. So for example, most people think that facts about the Big Bang are like that, or facts about, you know, life on Mars. I mean, there either is or isn't life on Mars, and we don't get to decide. Everyone could believe tomorrow that there's life on Mars. That wouldn't make it the case there was life on Mars. That would make it the case that a lot of people have false beliefs. Yeah. So that's what realism means. Now, the objectivity thing is a more subtle question, and I wonder if maybe we should go in two steps and first just talk about realism and then talk about objectivity, because because that distinction is often conflated, I think, with the realism distinction. So anyway, so realism then about ethics would be just analogously the view that, you know, it's not up to us whether giving to charity is obligatory. That's sort of up in the sky waiting to be discovered. And of course, the up in the sky language is a metaphor in the sense that someone who is a realist about ethics need not think there's literally like extra objects, the moral objects, like kind of on analogy with gravitons or something.
No fundamental units for morality.
Yeah. No, so it's important not to make a cartoon of moral realism. Moral realism is just the view that there's an answer to the question of, you know, whether I ought to give to charity, say, and I don't get to decide the answer. And neither does anybody else. That answer is to be discovered. And one thing people say who are realist in defense of this is that just think about the nature of deliberation. When we ask ourselves what we ought to do, we don't treat it like we can just introduce the fact at will. You know, we don't treat it like we can stipulate the answer. You know, I ask whether I should give to charity, and then I think about it. I don't just stipulate an answer. And that looks a lot like what I do when I ask whether there are infinitely many prime numbers. Yeah. I don't think I can stipulate an answer. I try to think through the question. And if, you know, I'm familiar with Euclid's proof, I'll conclude that there are. But that's what realism is. And you're absolutely right that most people today, and I think going back at least to Plato, have felt that that math is the paradigm of a subject where realism is the sensible view. So if there's anything, I mean, you know, there's such a thing as global relativism, where just everything is, you know, culture relative or something. And there's such a thing as, you know, global skepticism, where we don't know anything, literally, even that, you know, we exist. But setting those kinds of views aside, most sorts of skepticism are relative, or relativism are local. They're about certain areas. So people might be a skeptic or a relativist more likely about, say, aesthetics. Like, you know, aesthetics is in the eye of the beholder. But whether there are infinitely many prime numbers is not. You know, that's not something you get to decide. It's not like to each their own. Yeah. So why would someone be an anti-realist about math and a realist about ethics rather than a realist about math and an anti-realist about ethics? So the first thing I just want to say is my view actually is that I think that that realism about math is correct, but I think it's not objective in the sense that, we're going to talk about in a minute. Yeah. So I do, in a sense, think that there's a mind-independent answer to the question of whether there are infinitely many prime numbers. I just think that sense is a very boring sense in a way that I will explain. But why would somebody take the more, well, I don't know whether you call it more radical, but the view that there's no mind-independent fact about prime numbers, but there is a fact about ethics? Well, here's one reason. I said that in the ethics case, you don't need to believe in extra stuff. Like, it's not like there was a famous paper by the late Ronald Dworkin called "Objectivity and Truth. You'd Better Believe It." He was an advocate of moral realism, the idea that there's independent and he made fun of, this idea, like, I'm not saying there are, quote, morons, like bouncing around and we can detect them with, maybe we got to build a bigger particle accelerator or something. I'm just saying that, you ought to give to charity or you ought not kill people for the fun of it or whatever. And that's not up to me or anybody else. Okay, but in the math case, that kind of distinction is not so readily available. And the reason has to do with slightly technical issues in logic. It's about the logical form of sentences in ethics versus math. So what is the logical form? What I mean by that is, like, what are the conditions under which the sentence would be true? The sentence, say, 1 + 1 is 2. Well, logicians spent a long time analyzing this, especially at the turn of the 20th century. And, there's a very strong case to be made that the logical form of that is that 1 functions as a name. It talks about an object, the number 1. 2 functions as a name. It talks about another object, the number 2. And plus is a function between them. So 1 + 1 is 2, just in case there are numbers, the number 1 and 2, and 1 bears the plus function to itself and to 2, or the relation to itself and to 2. So that means that to be a realist about math, this is just the beginning. So you then start asking about things like, Hilbert spaces or, differential manifolds, or all these are objects, right? They're new things in the world. They're not properties predicated of the things we already agree to. So if I say something like, killing people for fun is wrong, I'm not saying there is an object, the wrong, and it bears some relation to objects and other objects in the world that we all agree to. I'm saying, look at the stuff we all agree to. Here's a fact about it.
Yeah.
Now that can seem like this Baroque, who cares distinction. But if you're interested in questions of what exists and what I should believe in, it's actually a crucial distinction. Math is ontologically committed, meaning it postulates new objects. Mm-hmm. And for those who are interested in the questions of, what are the fundamental axioms of math, the fundamental axioms of math are normally taken to be the axioms of set theory. And what gets set theory going are existence axioms. So what gets set theory going as a unique discipline is the axiom of infinity, which says that there is an inductive set, or intuitively, there is an infinite set. And the key point there is, I don't mean infinitely many things. I mean, you can collect them all, and there's an object which contains infinitely many things in it. So math is in the business of postulating objects, where ethics is kind of like, if you say something's like, that's a restaurant. Well, do you need to believe in restauranthood over and above, like, all the particles that are arranged restaurant-wise? Most people would say, no, that's not an ontological question. I just mean that when you get particles arranged a certain way, here's a fact. There's a restaurant there. Mm-hmm. So the moral realist position then is like the restaurant view, except assuming that whether something's a restaurant is independent in minds and languages. So it's maybe more like, claims about specieshood, or claims about the technical term for this is supervenient property that is whose distribution is fixed by the distribution of the underlying properties. So once you realize that, it becomes very actually tricky to be clear about whether there's anything metaphysical at stake in the debate about moral realism. It's and by metaphysical, I mean a debate about, the world, what exists, not about language. there's a case to be made that there is, but I'm just saying that it's not remotely as straightforward as the mathematical case, where it just seems like math is kind of like, you know, I mean, this is what Kurt Gödel taught, for instance. There's the sort of physical universe, and then there's the mathematical universe. And now you can ask what's the relation between them. But math is very straightforwardly postulating a whole realm of objects. And this is what Plato thought, of course.
Yeah.
So that's one reason, to get back to the original question, why someone might say, you know, this is a little too much to swallow. Plato's forms and the whole like mathematical realm is a little too much to swallow. So if 1 + 1 is 2 commits me to that, I need to figure out another way to think about 1 + 1 is 2. And so this is the view of what are called fictionalists about math. Like Hartree-Field is a paradigmatic fictionalist. He thinks that, strictly speaking, 1 + 1 is 2 is false. But don't worry, there's a lot of truths in the neighborhood that don't talk about numbers. And those are the truths that really matter. Things like, you know, if there's a Lego over here and there's a Lego over here, no Lego over here is a Lego over here, then there are exactly 2 Legos either here or here, where exactly 2 is just a claim of pure logic. I mean, it's a claim that you can write without talking about numbers.
Yeah.
So that's one reason. Now, that's not my view, but that's one reason why you might have the view that realism about ethics is true, because it's kind of cheap. It's like realism about restaurants or something. Whereas realism about math is a little too much to swallow.
So while we're on the topic of realism, and then we'll get to objectivity as well, you mentioned something interesting. You said math is in the business of postulating objects.
Right.
And you also brought up Gödel's mathematical universe and the physical universe. I just want you to linger on this a bit more. There are schools of thought at the moment. Max Tegmark is in one school of thought where he postulates that the universe is mathematical, that if you break down the universe into its fundamental units, you will come across mathematical objects. And the opposing school of thought is that mathematical objects like the wave function, for example, are nothing but representations of a physical reality. And maybe I'm assessing this wrong, if you take a pluralist view of mathematics, now you're making the case that you can make a different representative layer of this physical reality? Yes. Or can you also make the case that the universe is fundamentally mathematical? The current mathematics that we understand is just a representation of that. But at its core, fundamental units are mathematical objects, some objective mathematical object that we haven't discovered yet.
So, right. So in order to talk about this pluralism thing, we have to talk about the objectivity thing. So maybe we should let's
dive into it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'll give you the short version of what the issue is. And then, you know, there's a million technicalities that we can or can't talk about, whether you want to or not. So
we have all night.
Okay. Yeah. So we're going to talk about it all. So here's the short version of the pluralism versus what we'll call objectivism. So I said realism is the view that about an area is the view that there are facts that are independent of us. Okay. That's what people have traditionally focused on. But there's sort of this other dimension, it seems like, in which you can assess an area. And a way to see it is that already within pure mathematics itself, realists take very different attitudes towards different areas. So let's return to number theory and the view that there are infinitely many prime numbers. But let's compare that now to another area that's ancient, and you know, it's everyone can get a grip on it: geometry, right? So you know, as is well known in Euclid's Elements, one of the postulates was the parallel postulate. In one formulation, if you have two straight lines and they start off parallel to each other, they remain parallel to each other. Yep. You know, people felt like maybe this has a different flavor than the other axioms, and so people kept trying to prove it from the other axioms, and eventually it was discovered that you can add its negation consistently, and you just get another geometry. And eventually, you know, the subject of differential geometry was discovered, where you can just, you know, vary curvature arbitrarily from place to place, and you can sort of just make a geometry to order.
Yep.
Okay, so these days, what is the reasonable Platonist view about geometry? Nobody thinks that, I mean, again, it's always risky to say nobody. Nobody that I know of thinks that if you set aside physical geometry, and we'll come back to this, I'm sure, but set aside physical geometry for a second. I'm talking about pure mathematics. Nobody thinks that there's a pie in the sky answer to the question of whether the parallel postulate is true. Of course, once you decide what you mean by the terms, the answer does not depend on us. It's not, we don't get to make it the case that the parallel postulate is true of Euclidean geometry. Euclidean geometry is if you're a realist, is the facts about it are independent of us. Okay, but along with Euclidean geometry, there's hyperbolic geometry and elliptic geometry, and then variably curved geometries. So in a sense that comes apart from realism, the question of whether the parallel postulate is true doesn't have an objective answer. Like if you want the parallel postulate false, I've got hyperbolic geometry for you. You know, if you want it true, I've got Euclidean geometry. If you and I found ourselves disagreeing over whether as a pure mathematical question, the parallel postulate was really true, we would quickly discover that we're confused because all we're talking about is what we mean by some words. Yeah. Like there's nothing metaphysical to debate. We both agree that there's spaces making it false, spaces making it true. There's nothing special about one over the other. Mm-hmm. So all we would learn is how we happen to be using words in a particular context and like, you know, ask the linguists. So here's a question. Is all of math like that? In other words, are all the axioms of our fundamental theories, like set theory, are they like the parallel postulate? Whenever you can consistently take it or its negation, is there just kind of no deep fact? It's like there's a world corresponding to it, there's a world corresponding to its negation, and there's the reason why there's a million, flashing lights red lights go off for people who study this stuff when you start to make that comparison is there's a lot of superficial differences between the cases that aren't just, it doesn't seem like it's like geometry. So I said, compare it to number theory. It doesn't seem like number theory is like geometry. It seems like there's one true natural number structure and, there's an answer yes or no as to whether or not there are infinite many prime numbers and so forth. But there's a deeper point that's not just gestalt. It's that in the case of like, say, set theory, these are meta theories in which one talks about the different geometries. They're the background fundamental assumptions you get to make in all mathematical reasoning. In the case of geometry, you're not pretending to talk about the fundamental axioms of math. This is just these are just axioms for some particular structure within, in a set theoretic context, within the vast realm of set theoretic reality. So the question of whether or not set theory itself is like geometry then is kind of like whether there's any whether there's any once and for all answer to the questions of what axioms am I allowed to assume? What are the basic facts about math? What are the basic assumptions that you're allowed to do in, say, reasoning about functions or power sets or, or any mathematical object of interest? The pluralist perspective now is, this is just a term that I use to contrast. I'll use pluralism for the view I'm about to define and objectivism for its negation, for the opposite view. Okay. Pluralism is the view that the answer is yes. We have to get our head around the idea that even the most basic, the fundamental background assumptions to all of reasoning, for those who, are familiar with the lingo, are meta theory, are fundamental meta theoretic assumptions. Are like the parallel postulate assumption. It's sort of a conventional matter which you use. By that, I don't mean that the answer doesn't depend on us, right? Yeah. What I mean is you can have it either way and the world will cooperate.
But there's no objective mathematical universe.
Exactly. There's no objective mathematical universe, but it's there's lots of mind-independent universes. Okay. You know what I mean? Like the world is a plentiful, cooperative place mathematically is the idea. Okay. Okay. So my view, right, is that pluralism is true and realism is true at the same time about mathematics. Now, in the case of morality, you can see why, going back to this deliberation question, why there would be something off about that combination of positions for a realist about ethics. Like, unlike the math case, deliberation issues in action. You ask yourself what I ought to do, but not just to discover another fact about the world. Like, not like, is the parallel postulate true? Okay, check. but to decide what to do, to decide now, okay, I'm going to move my body somehow. And the problem is I can only move my body in a given case one way. not in the, like, that sentence is ambiguous, but the point is doing one thing precludes doing its opposite in a given context at a time, So it's not very helpful to be like, along with morality, there's schmorality. And the answer to the question of what ought I do is, I ought to give to charity, but what should I do? Or ought star say I do, I ought star not give to charity. Okay, now what to do, whether to do what I ought or ought star to do. And you don't want to, this turtles all the way down if we keep just repeating factual claims about the world. So my view is that in the ethical case, whether or not realism is true about ethics is really a question of natural language semantics. It's a question of whether or not when I say I ought to do something, I'm talking about the facts in the world, or rather talking about my deliberative conclusions.
Yep.
So there's no kind of metaphysical question at stake. But whatever you want to say about that, there's another question I have to answer, which cannot admit of this plurality of answers in the way that the mathematical questions do. There's a deliberative question, what to do.
Yeah.
And that question cannot be resolved by the facts, because whenever you tell me a fact, I can always wonder to do whether what I ought to do
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe I should do what I ought star to do instead. So what to do isn't the same as what I ought to do as understood as the realist understands it, is my thought. So anyway, right. So that the result is realism, anti-objectivism about math. It's all like geometry, roughly speaking. And in the ethical case, at least when it comes to questions of what to do, whether or not that's what we mean in natural language by what I ought to do, that's anti-realist and, in a sense, objective. It can only get one answer. But of course, it can only get one answer. There's a bit ambiguous because, there's lots of different answers, but the point is you can only have one.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of combo that is a little bit puzzling. It teases two ideas apart that traditionally people would use interchangeably, realism and objectivity.
So many follow-up questions for you.
I didn't mean to filibuster. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so I have a lot of questions for you about everything you just mentioned. Let's park aside the morality question, the ethical question about what to do, what ought to do.
Yeah.
Let's start with the beginning. So you made the case that math is realist but anti-objective.
Yes.
I want to go to your book, Morality and Mathematics. In that you've said, I have argued that the case for moral and mathematical realism is surprisingly parallel. Our mathematical beliefs have no better claim to being self-evident, provable, plausible, or analytic than our moral beliefs. Nor do our mathematical beliefs have better claim to being empirically justified than our moral beliefs. It is also incorrect that reflection on the genealogy of the moral beliefs undermines them, while reflection on the genealogy of our mathematical beliefs does not. What is true is that our moral beliefs are contingent in a worrying way, and this may disqualify them from counting as safe, realistically construed. However, exactly the same thing is true of our mathematical beliefs. So contrary to the majority of the quotations that began this book, if one is a moral anti-realist on the basis of any such epistemological considerations, then one ought to be a mathematical anti-realist as well. We spoke about making the case for math being realist, but also not objective. Mm-hmm. But I just want you to linger on this coupling between the two, this parallelism that you're trying to draw. This last line, if one is a moral anti-realist, then one ought to be a mathematical anti-realist as well. Why do they walk hand in hand? If you make the case that maths is anti-realist, then how do you make the case that morality is also anti-realist?
Yeah, good. So just to be clear about as you set this up, right? So the book is a little bit strange because it says that people have traditionally thought ethics and math are so different and so on, and all of the book until chapter 6 is actually they're really, really similar, and all the differences that come immediately to mind, like in math you can prove things, and in ethics you can't prove things. Like math applies to the physical world and ethics doesn't. Like evolution explains our ethical beliefs but not our math, so on and so forth. Those turn out, I argue, not to be significant differences or not differences at all. However, in the final chapter, I say there is a difference, and that's this thing about deliberation and objectivity that we can come back to. So let's set aside the deliberation objectivity thing and just talk about what you might call like companions and guilt, right? This idea that, you know, certainly cuts against what I think is the tenor, not just of philosophical discussion, but I think if you ask, as you said earlier, anybody on the street or a typical scientist or whatever, and the quote in the book begins with just all these quotes from, you know, famous people of all kinds saying exactly this. So how do you get the case that if you're what I think you're asking is, if you're an anti-realist about ethics on the basis of epistemological arguments, you got to be an anti-realist about math too.
Exactly.
Right. So the answer is you go one by one through the arguments and you see whether you can make the case equally in the mathematical case. So we can talk about all of them or some of them, but, you know, let me give some illustrations. So I think a very natural place to start when you're wondering, like, you know, that sure sounds like a quacky thing to say, is to think about proof and the different methodologies. So, I mean, certainly superficially, math seems totally different than ethics. You know, in math class, somebody lectures to you. Yeah. You know, there's a right answer. In ethics class, it starts with debate, you know? So it's extremely natural to be like, what are you talking about? Like, these are totally different things. But you gotta, again, sort of look under the hood a little bit and return to these issues that, as I say, brought me to philosophy. These questions that people like Russell and Frege and the founders of analytic philosophy and logic took the time to make precise, which is, what do you mean by proof? What do you mean by axiom? And there's a mismatch in the projects of ethics and math that makes it very hard to compare at first pass which is on better epistemological footing. Epistemology, for people who aren't up on the lingo, just means the theory of knowledge. So like better footing when it comes to like sort of intellectual credentials.
Yep.
And here's the difference. In ethics, we're at first pass trying to figure out just what's categorically the case. Should you give to charity or not? In math, what we're trying to figure out at first pass is what follows from some axioms. So, you know, if you want to know whether every vector space has a basis, are you really trying to figure out whether, period, every vector space has a basis, or rather whether you can prove that from the axioms that your teacher taught you that you never even took a day to discuss?
Yeah.
In fact, I'm already over-intellectualizing how math actually goes. As anyone who actually studies math will know, it's very rare to even be exposed to the axioms of math once in your life. In class itself, I mean, you might on your own decide to read about ZFC set theory, but it's not normal to take a course in set theory. It's not normal to take a course in logic. And it's not abnormal to not even know what, say, the axiom of replacement is.
Why is that?
So there are different explanations for this, and I'll tell you the one that I think is the right one, rather than give you all of them. I think the reason is because it's turned out to be productive to prove theorems, where what I mean by that is establish what follows from what. And you want a common corral, a common framework from which to prove the theorems. And so once we came up with a framework in which most of the things people wanted to prove could be proved, and the people who had thought about it a lot seemed to like them okay, and the rivals were not obviously better than the candidates, yeah, the best policy was just to, you know, assume those as background assumptions and start teaching students things that presuppose them without argument. Because another way to put it is, you would never prove any theorems in the logical sense, figuring out what follows from what, if you first had to settle what axioms are true. Because you then turn math into philosophy.
Right.
This is something that people don't realize, but there are debates about the axioms. They happen in philosophy departments mostly, but it's not like the debates went away. They got quarantined. It's just like the foundations of physics in this way. You mentioned the wave function and like, what is it? Is it a representation?
Yeah.
What's the right interpretation of quantum mechanics? That makes it sound like it's like, you know, how to interpret a fiction book or something. But these different interpretations give different theoretical predictions. So they're not just wordplay. I mean, the GRW theory makes a different prediction in terms of collapse than the Copenhagen interpretation, Bohmian interpretation, and so forth.
Bell's inequality.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So similarly, the foundations of physics, there are these questions about fundamentals, but they got quarantined because a certain methodology of just using the Schrodinger equation, or in the case of quantum field theory, it's the Heisenberg picture, I guess, that's used more often. But using these mathematical instruments reliably, and now even getting technological benefits potentially with quantum computing, I mean, obviously, we've got a million technological benefits otherwise from quantum mechanics, but I mean, specifically with these foundational matters about collapse of the wave function, you know, leave it to the philosophers. And so there's become this segregation in academia, for better or worse. I'm not claiming actually this is a bad thing necessarily. I think division of cognitive labor is sometimes a very good thing. There can be no denying that in a certain sense of progress, math has made enormous progress in the 20th century. But it's not the sense that Russell was after. And that's why Russell famously says, I think this is in his intellectual autobiography, he said, you know, I wanted certainty so bad, and I thought math is the best place to find it. And so I did what I could with Alfred North Whitehead to find it, to found all of math on logic, so there could be no doubts. And I discovered that it's just turtles all the way down. And so I left philosophy of math. And it's a very interesting thing about Russell's biography, right? I mean, he's a beautiful writer, as you illustrated already. He also is one of the greatest logicians of the 20th century. And he gave up logic early in his career. He never did logic again. He eventually contacted Gödel about his theorem, and he clearly didn't understand the first thing about it. I mean, the question was just so confused. He was like, should we think that 1 plus 1 equals 0 or something? Because he thought, look, I like math because I like certainty. And actually, it turns out math is not the land of certainty. So back to your question, like, why has math decided to focus on what it's focused on, and you don't have to worry about axioms, and you can be a brilliant mathematician and not even know what the schema of replacement says, or what the compactness theorem in metalogic is, or whatever? It's because that project, the project of proving theorems from axioms, which for better or worse, they're just the ones that, the contingent evolution of the set theoretic enterprise landed on, has turned out to be very productive in some respects. It's just not the respects of the people who were worried about the foundations of math, because it hasn't settled any of those debates. It hasn't, for example, given us certainty in the sense that Russell wanted. People are familiar maybe with, Gödel's second incompleteness theorem, that, if a theory like piano arithmetic is consistent, then it can't prove that it's consistent. Now, the relevance of that and stuff is very much, you can dispute it, but, there's all these just limited results. And meanwhile, what do? And there are two things you can do. You can do philosophy of math and keep thinking about these issues, or you can sort of move on. And the mathematical community has kind of moved on in exactly the way the physics community moved on with the problems to do with the Einstein.
But how do you move on if you haven't established the foundations? Like, if this is analogous to a building, you're saying the foundations are still up for debate.
Yeah.
But for a matter of convenience and productivity, we've just moved on to the next layer, even though there's so much debate. To me now, you said you're not making a case whether this is for better or worse, but I think, if you just think intuitively, you need to focus all your efforts and resources into securing the foundational beliefs, and then you can build up, like a bottom-up approach.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a totally, I think, defensible point of view, but I do want to, be fair to, the mathematical community and the sort of pragmatists.
Sure.
And I think one view among the pragmatists in both the foundations of physics and foundations of math is kind of like, it turns on just a general criticism of philosophy. Now, I think the criticism of philosophy is confused, and that's why I don't endorse this point of view. But here's what I think they would say. Look, philosophy doesn't make any progress. We can make progress, on the other hand, doing this other thing. So let's do the other thing. Now, kind of like with the word proof, progress is a very ambiguous word. And I think that's doing all the work. When you disambiguate what you can mean by progress, well, it makes progress in one sense, not in another. And, depends on what you care about. Yeah. Yeah. I don't remember even how that got started.
I'm to blame. I took us down this road, but we were ultimately talking about making the parallel case between mathematics and morality. And then we got into the world of...
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So I can, if you want me to go through the other parallels, I'm happy to, but this is, as you can see, it's there's a lot to be said. So we were talking about parallels in particular, why does the fact that math has proof and ethics doesn't show that there's a lack of parallel? And the answer is, well, you're being ambiguous with the word proof. We do have proofs in the logical sense of ethics too. You can formalize different ethical theories and prove what follows from them. People do that. It's called deontic logic. But that doesn't settle anything about whether I really ought to kill the one to save the five or something, right? Because it depends on what axioms are true. And the point is that in ethics, we're not content to just be like, okay, let's use these axioms.
I'm to blame here because I'm going down these rabbit holes. Let's go back to what we were talking about.
Sure, yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned that we can start questioning all these axioms that we consider true.
That's right.
I'm a simple man, Professor. I'm like Winston Smith from George Orwell's 1984, where I'm writing in my diary that the freedom is freedom to say that 2 + 2 is 4. And if you grant me that, everything else follows. Are you telling me that you can now question all your axioms and proofs in such a way that you can construct a world where 2 + 2 is not 4? This is the foundation of my education.
So 2 + 2 is 4. Again, it's I remember talking to Sean Carroll once, and he was like, "This is the great thing about philosophers. They can, they can complicate a question like whether 2 + So look, I told you how that is understood according to orthodoxy in logic and mathematical logic. And in mathematical logic, just like 1 + 1 is 2, 2 + 2 is 4 is a claim that involves names and picks things out. And so if you think there could fail to be any numbers, it certainly could fail to be the case that 1 + 1 is 2 or 2 + 2 is 4, because 2 + 2 is 4 is only true if there are objects, the number 2 and the number 4, and 2 bears the plus relation to itself and to 4.
But you're making the realist case for mathematics, so there are those numbers.
Oh, right. So what's I thought you were asking me like, okay, so maybe you're saying, so maybe you're wondering, okay, so it's not the case that that these things on my view are false, but it is the case on my view that it's all like geometry.
Mm-hmm.
And what in the hell do you mean by a non-Euclidean arithmetic or something?
Sure.
So the line in the book is actually that arithmetic is special. So in other words, on my view, it's actually not the case that there's, in any interesting sense, a universe in which 2 + 2 is 5. Here's why I say in any interesting sense. There's something called the completeness theorem. The completeness theorem on the standard formulation says that anything that really follows from anything else in first order logic, there's a proof of it in a standard proof system. But another formulation of that is if you have any set of sentences that's syntactically consistent, meaning you can't derive a contradiction from it, there's a model of it. There's an interpretation of those sentences in which everything comes out true. Yeah. So that means because 2 + 2 is 5 is certainly first order consistent, there's a model of 2 + 2 is 5. So in a sense of universe, there is a universe in which 2 + 2 is 5, according to anyone. This is back to the question about there's a million technicalities about what pluralism means in the meta theory. So here's one of the technicalities. Yeah. It can't just mean the completeness theorem. It can't just mean whenever you have a consistent set of axioms, you can find a model of that, because everybody agrees with that. It has to mean that whenever you have a consistent set of axioms, there's an intended model. Where intended model, first of all, is not even a model because it's not a set. It's too big to be a set. There's no set that is the universe of set theory. One of the theorems of ZFC is that there can't be. So when I say that, for example, there's a universe in which the axiom of choice fails, which is just a standard axiom of set theory, I don't mean just that you can find a model of it if you can find a model of ZF, because that follows from a result of Cohen and Gödel. Well, Cohen in the case of failure, and the completeness theorem. I mean, there's an intended model. There's a universe that is the one we envision when we envision the failure of choice, and there's a universe in which choice holds, and these are equally legit, kind of like the different geometries. But why is arithmetic, in my view, special? So that I think you're right. 2 + 2 is 5. I'm a simple man about arithmetic too.
4.
And
2 + 2 is.
But no. But the point is, I thought you were saying that like you can't have 2 + 2 is 5. Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the reason that I think arithmetic is special is because Gödel taught us that that meta-theoretic claims about what you can and can't prove from theories are really arithmetic claims in disguise. So if you start fooling with arithmetic and say that any arithmetic theory that's consistent is as good as any other, you start fooling with claims about consistency and what follows from what. So for example, let me just illustrate. So right, I mentioned Gödel's second incompleteness theorem says, for example, this is just one theory that you can apply it to. It's more general than this, but if piano arithmetic is consistent, then it can't prove that it's consistent. Okay, it immediately follows from that piano arithmetic plus the claim it's inconsistent is consistent if piano arithmetic is consistent. Because otherwise it could prove its own consistency if it were consistent, and it can't by the theorem. Okay, so what if I say any consistent theory, even arithmetic theories, are as good as any other? Well, then piano arithmetic, plus the claim that it's inconsistent has to be.
Yep.
But I just said that piano arithmetic is consistent. That's why this conjunction is consistent. Because if piano arithmetic were inconsistent, then certainly the conjunction of piano arithmetic with the claim that it's inconsistent would be inconsistent. But one of the claims of this theory is that it's inconsistent. So there's a kind of incoherence. It's not officially an inconsistency because there's a meta theory, object theory distinction going on. But there's a kind of incoherence about, on the one hand, claiming that any consistent theory, including arithmetic theories, are as good as any other. And on the other hand, saying that include like as good as any other, meaning like true of their intended subjects. And on the other hand, saying that piano arithmetic plus the claim it's inconsistent is consistent because it says it's inconsistent. Now, here's why that's, you could argue about this. This is not my view, but you could argue about this. What officially is going on, a model from our perspective of piano arithmetic plus the claim that it's inconsistent, a model of that is officially what's called a non-standard model of arithmetic, where you have the natural numbers as we think of them, but then you have this number that has no name. It's not the referent of any numeral. And it's the number witnessing via Gödel numbering a proof of 0 = 1. So the claim that piano arithmetic is inconsistent is the claim there is a natural number and it codes a proof of 0 = 1. So how could you have a model of that? Well, you have to have a model where there's a non-standard number, a number that's not finitely many steps away from 0, that codes the proof of 0 = 1. So here's what you could say. You could say, actually, you can be more wild, and you can say that even PA plus not con PA is the abbreviation for piano arithmetic plus the claim it's inconsistent is true of its intended subject. You could say that theory isn't asserting what we assert when we say that piano arithmetic is inconsistent, because you got to look at the model in which it's true. And a model in which it's true is a model in which things like proof and consistency mean something different. Mm-hmm. So I won't go on to give you a full explanation of why I think that's not a good argument, but the short version is I don't think in general you can hold that the meaning of a theory is given by its class of models. And if you grant that, then there's something special about arithmetic, and I'm with you. I'm a simple-minded person about arithmetic, but nothing else.
Let's do a thought experiment. Let's say
yes,
we bump into aliens tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's mutual agreement on the fact that there are prime numbers and they're digits of pi? If you say no, then I think Carl Sagan might disagree with you, because this was the central premise of his book Contact, that the universal language for communicating with extraterrestrial civilizations, different universes, is mathematics, that we can all agree on the fact that the digits of pi are fixed and prime numbers exist.
So the honest answer is I have doubts about that. But the view in the book, which is my tentative view to date, is that they'd agree about arithmetic. So they'd agree about prime numbers. Okay. They wouldn't agree with us, though, about, even the axiom of infinity necessarily. They wouldn't agree with us about the schema of replacement or the power set axiom or the axiom of choice or the axiom of foundation. In other words, almost all of math outside of first order number theory, I think different aliens will give you different answers and there won't be a common language. And I think, by the way, I'm no Carl Sagan expert, but my guess is that, he's coming from a place where there's just a lot of sociology explaining this. Because think about if mathematicians aren't exposed to the axioms of math as a general rule, then physicists all the more aren't, right? I mean, like physics is even a further step removed from the question of what basic assumptions are we allowed to use in mathematical reasoning? And is there a pie in the sky answer to that question? And so it's very natural, I think, if you're trained in physics, you've only ever seen the same kinds of assumptions used. Sometimes they're even mathematically dubious, but the questions of set theory and logic are so far removed. I mean, for example, when people worry about the consistency of quantum field theory, they're not even worried about the consistency in the sense of the logician. That's another step removed. Yeah. They're worried in a kind of informal mathematical sense about that. So I wouldn't want to reduce somebody as brilliant as Carl Sagan I wouldn't want to reduce his views to sociology. But my guess is, it would be interesting to know, did Carl Sagan know set theory? I would think that'd be interesting. Had he ever taken a metalogic class? Had he ever been exposed to the variety of possibilities? Because it's very, I think, had I never been exposed, had I never learned that, there's a perfectly reasonable alternative to the axiom of foundation. There's a perfectly reasonable alternative to the axiom of power set. There are all these different set theories and I can learn to work with them. And what could it mean to say that there's one true answer to the question of, whether unrestricted, whether the axiom schema of replacement holds for all instances? So I think that a large part of this is just the sociology that we talked about before, which is, this is a very Baroque area of theoretical inquiry that most people never need to, but never, more importantly, just never do get exposed to and have to think about. And in this respect, again, it parallels, I think, a lot of philosophical areas like the foundations of physics.
My entire life has been a lie. I don't know. I don't know if
I agree. No,
I agree. No. I don't know if you had a similar feeling, but my first class of chemistry in year 11, it started off with the claim that everything you've learned in chemistry so far has been a lie. Like electrons are now in a fixed orbit around the nucleus. There's a whole probability electron cloud. Not even year 11, like kindergarten, they teach you the sun rises in the east. I feel like education in general starts with the foundation on a lie. And then today you walk in here and you're telling me that 2 + 2 might be 4 because we are simple men. But everything else about Euclidean geometry or everything else, a set theory that I've learned about is subjective to a certain extent.
Or you might say relative is slightly more. Yeah, right. It's like geometry. Yeah.
What's the point?
That's the answer. Yeah.
What's the point? Today's the day. On camera, you're going to capture my first foray into nihilism. Like, what is the point if everything's a lie?
Yeah, right. Let's talk about nihilism.
Yeah. Let's talk. You want to talk about nihilism?
Not particularly, but actually, well, no.
I'm feeling it at the moment. Okay. We parked aside the question about morality. Let's go back to it. And let's bring in a thought experiment about morality as well. So we were talking earlier about making the case that morality can be realist and objective, just like math, right? We were trying to...
Right. If you set aside the 6th chapter of the book, right?
Yeah. So if you, like, they walk hand in hand. So I want to now explore this further. You brought up the questions, what to do, what I ought to do. Let's bring up a thought experiment. I'm going to come up with a thought experiment on the spot. I'm sure you've never heard of this one before. Let's assume there's a trolley and it's hurtling down a track.
Right.
You're standing at a distance. There's a lever next to you. You can switch tracks with the trolley. You have 2 actions at the moment. If the trolley continues down its track, it's going to kill 5 people who are on the track, can't move. If you pull the lever, switch the tracks, the trolley is going to go move to the second track where there's 1 person who can't move. So the big question is whether you kill 5 or you kill 1. Came up with this thought experiment on the spot. I'm sure you've never heard of this.
It's really good.
Thank you. Yeah, it's not a classic thought experiment at all.
No.
And the central question is, what is the right thing to do, right? But let's break it down into the 3 questions that you provided earlier. The first question is what I ought to do, which is a question around ethics. There's another question, I guess this is the deliberation, the action, what I will do. I guess it's a descriptive question around...
Right, there's a descriptive question.
Yeah, around like, I guess, predictive psychology.
Right.
And then we're squeezing in this additional question that you mentioned in the middle, which is what to do.
Right.
Let's linger on this a bit more. You introduced the topic earlier, but let's talk about the philosophy of breaking into these three questions. What is the fundamental difference between these three questions? Why should we break this problem down to these three questions?
Good. Yeah. So, the what I ought to do for purposes of the discussion, I think it's best to just stipulate we will interpret that as realists interpret it, meaning that just like in the math case, we just look at the language and give the best analysis of the language. Let's do that with the ethics case. So what I ought to do then, I mean, most linguists today, I think, would say that that involves an operator, but that's not relevant for our discussion. So, you know, we could say like killing the one to save the five is good. That's a subject predicate claim according to standard linguistic analysis, and so that's just a claim about the world. It's just like a claim like that's a restaurant or that's a couch, right? So it's like you pick something out that we all agree to exist. We're ascribing a predicate to it. There's a debate that I gestured at the beginning of this discussion, which is kind of like, what's the metaphysical issue when we grant that what are called the subvenient facts are there, the things that, yeah, but okay, so there's that question. There's also then just a question of, as you said, descriptive psychology. You know, is part of the business of psychology is to predict what humans will do in different circumstances, and it's unnerving, but you know, sometimes they can do it. Even when we feel free, for example, sometimes they can tell what you're going to do before you you have conscious knowledge of making the decision. So, you know, however much I take no stand on that, but there is that question. There's just the descriptive predictive question. You know, what will Justin do in this circumstance?
Yeah.
But right, I think there's another question, and it brings itself out by considering the issue of pluralism. But pluralism is not a necessary component to getting this question. The question comes out whenever we question our own normative concepts. So whenever we ask ourselves, like, you know, there's a lot of concepts we've inherited which we've decided are bad concepts. They involve presuppositions which are false, or maybe they're just corrupt or not useful, or, you know, there's something bad about them. So we give them up and replace them with new ones. So, you know, you mentioned being taught in kindergarten that you know, the sun rises. Well, yeah, right. Similarly, yeah, maybe it's built into the concept of the you know, our kindergarten conception of the sun that it rises or something. And so we give up that concept and we learn a slightly different concept that's very similar to that one, but instead it's about the relative positions of the earth and the sun rather than about the absolute rising of the sun or something. Yeah. And similarly, you know, we gave up the concept of the ether, and we gave up the concept of absolute velocity and things like this. Okay, so you can imagine, and people have made the point vivid, like Nietzsche makes the point vivid, that we somehow have inherited normative. Normative just means having to do with norms. So I'm talking about any concept that has to do with norms. It doesn't have to be morality per se, but it certainly includes morality.
Yep.
You can imagine learning that, you know, our normative concepts were inherited, you know, via some process or from some group or something that should call into question whether to follow them. Right. So let me give you a very like down to earth example of something that I think is probably not impossible. So it could be that our concept of responsibility, moral responsibility, entails that if you're responsible for something, you deserve retribution. So it's just part of that concept that if you're morally responsible, you deserve retribution. Now, I don't know whether that's true. I'm just imagine that's true. It could happen. I mean, you know, it's a concept, and the concepts can come with lots of things built into them. So let's just imagine that's true. Would that then settle the question of whether to retribute, whether to respond to those responsible as opposed to practicing forgiveness or something? I'm not saying you should practice forgiveness against the responsible. I'm saying, would that settle the question? Knowing that someone is in fact responsible. does that settle whether they deserve retribution? And you might say, well, sure, it settles whether they deserve retribution, but it doesn't settle whether to retribute. And the point is that that's not just a kind of disconnect in the sense that we have disconnects with weakness of will, right? Sometimes I fail to do what I know I ought to do, but I endorse that value and just can't get myself to do it because I'm too selfish or something. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying sometimes we fail to endorse the moral facts, or at least we can. We can intelligibly ask ourselves whether to endorse, say, this notion of responsibility. Or should we instead replace it with another notion, responsibility star, which doesn't build in retribution? So the person is responsible, I grant that. It's all the conditions are met. But I'm not going to retribute even though they deserve, by definition, retribution. Because I endorse responsibility star.
Yeah.
That's the roadmap I'm going to use. You can think then of all of these different, moral like theories. I'm calling them moral like because morality is whatever we actually refer to, right? So there's like morality and schmorality star and so forth. And there's all these you can think of them all as just different prescriptions, like, a bunch of instruction manuals. Now the question is which instruction manual to use. That's not the question of which I ought to use, because I'll be speaking some language using some instruction manual, and any reasonable instruction manual is going to tell me, use me.
Yeah.
It's going to be self-sanctioning. So that's why I think there's there's deliberative distance. So yeah, there's the question of just what's good and bad understood as a factual matter. And I don't see any particular reason actually to think there can't be mind-independent facts about that, as I've said. I think realism is actually not a particularly dramatic position once you really get clear on what it would involve. But you can sort of see how it's a letdown if there's this extra question. Because you wanted realism to not just there to be facts about what I ought to do, but to somehow they settle deliberation. But what could that possibly mean? They settle deliberation. You don't want it to mean they make you do something, because maybe don't do what I have to do. So what I think is that realism, in the sense that I think realists really want, it's not just false. There's not a coherent position there. They're confusing things about our deliberation, the deliberative standpoint, with things about the world and the facts. And I should say that I'm not the first person in the world to think there's something incoherent about moral realism, but this is I hope a useful kind of new way to put the problem. Like Mackey famously said that moral properties would be, utterly mysterious and different from anything we've ever seen. That might be right, but what's the problem exactly? It's that if you try to give content to this idea that they settle deliberation, there's just no way to do it that doesn't end up making it really about us. It's up to me. Like there could be a descriptive fact that whenever I consult those facts, I end up doing the thing they tell me to. That's not what we want. We want it to be the case that somehow the facts make it the case that do that. What could that mean?
So how do you settle on which responsibility you're going to ascribe to? Responsibility or responsibility star? How do you solve that question?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, here, I think it's possible to put some progress that's been made in a different vein to use. So there is a longstanding position in analytic philosophy about ethics and normative language generally, and the position is called non-cognitivism, and it's had a lot of variations, but one variation that's famous was endorsed, for example, in a very provocative and popular book by a young A.J. Ayer, Language, Truth, and Logic, is called emotivism. And I'll tell you the punchline, and then as usual with philosophical questions, there's a million technicalities we can or can't talk about if you want to. So the punchline is that ethics is not in the business of describing anything. It's not in the business of stating facts. You're just misunderstanding. You got misled by looking at the surface grammar and thinking that this was, when I say, that's red, and I say that's bad, those two sentences look like the same kind of thing, and the moral realist gets misled and thinks that they must answer to the same kind of thing. They're two facts, and the world either cooperates or not. People like A.J. Ayer and the emotivists, but more generally the non-cognitivists, think that ethics and more generally normative language is not in the business of stating facts at all. Now, what is it in the business of? That's where there's some disagreement. So one view, an early view, the emotivist view, was that it's literally in the business of venting emotion. It's like being at a football game and saying, you know, yay, Bears. Like that can't be true or false. That's the kind of thing where, you know, where you might fully endorse it in a certain sense if you're on the same side, but it's not the kind of thing that you can be criticized because it's false. The emotivist idea is when you say like that's bad, it looks like it's the kind of thing that can be false, but it's really just like boo, you know, the Tigers.
Yeah.
Okay, so there were a bunch of problems with that very primitive idea, but it's been refined. And the two main, I think, contenders these days for what normative language is doing among the non-cognitivist tradition is, one view is that it's expressing approval or disapproval or higher order approval or disapproval of our own approval practices. That's a kind of view that Simon Blackburn has. Another view that has been developed by Alan Gibbard is that it's actually a way of expressing hypothetical plans of an idealized kind. So to say that, you know, you ought to do something is sort of to express a plan to do it, or that you would do it in a certain circumstance, something like that. Okay, here's the point. All that literature has been, in my view, kind of, it's always dangerous to say this, I think it's been a little bit misguided by focusing so much on semantics. So the debate has been, what is the actual semantics of moral language? Mm-hmm. And famously, as I said, you know, Ayer and people like this proposed the view that it's just venting emotion. There was the response then known as the Frege-Geach problem, which said, wait, but it can't just vent emotion because, for example, logic applies to ethics. You can be criticized for being inconsistent. You can, you know, we call ethical claims true or false. We call, you know, these truths are self-evident, whatever. So you have to somehow do justice to the fact that on the surface, all of the semantic features of ordinary language are had by ethical and normative language. How do you deal with that? Okay, blah, 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 blah. People like Gibbard come up with a view about that. And then the debate ends up being about which one is right of natural language. Yep. My view is that who cares about natural language? I mean, maybe our language is misconceived, but the work of the fancy emotivists, the non-cognitivists, is very useful because we can use it to understand what deliberation about what to do amounts to and how we can do it. And so Gibbard has a view about, you know, idealized plans, which I think is pretty good. Now, I happen to disagree with him on one key point, which has made my life quite difficult because now I have to, unfortunately, I can't just like, you know, I agree with Gibbard on this. Something is going to have to get messed with. Gibbard famously thinks that there's no possibility of weakness of will with respect to the what to do question. So transposing to my language, what Gibbard is saying is that questions of what we ought to do in natural language really are just questions of what to do. And that's just a plan to do something.
Okay.
Roughly speaking.
It's all one question.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that, whether or not he's right about the first point, that's a question of natural language semantics. There is a question, which is the one that settles deliberation, but doesn't settle planning. I can plan to do what, don't do that, Justin. Yeah. I can be weak in will with respect to this what to do question, is my view. That means that unfortunately, I can't just adopt Gibbard's hyperplan, you know, superstructure and use that to answer your question. But the short version is I'm working on it, and I think it's connected with the answer Gibbard gives to how to reason about what to do, in the sense that you can't be weak in will, in the sense of planning. So I think there is progress on that question. It's in the non-cognitivist tradition trying to answer a different question, but I don't think it can be quite right because it doesn't allow for weakness of will with respect to what to do as it's been presented.
I'm still a bit confused about how you actually settling on selecting which model responsibility style. Like, how do you actually come up with this intended giant model from which you're creating these representations, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the key is that it's like a sui generis kind of decision. So it can't be understood in terms of, thought about the facts and what evidence I have for the facts and so forth, except the descriptive facts will, of course, be relevant, like what gives rise to happiness and so on. But it's about valuing and desire and these things where they can't be understood as claims about desire or valuing, because those don't settle deliberation. I may value the wrong things as a descriptive fact. So look, it's a really good question. And I think there should be more focus on exactly that question rather than what's the right semantics of natural language. How do we settle deliberation, assuming that it's not settled by knowledge of the facts? And as I say, I think it can't be as simple as the emotivists and the non-cognitivists to date have said, but something in that territory, which is completely non-factual and non-cognitive. It's kind of like in the realm of emotions, I think is correct. But I mean, you're not going to get anything very, very informative from me on it because I'm working on it. I think it's hard.
Are you saying you're not going to solve the problem in this episode?
Give me 5 minutes. Give me 5 minutes.
False promises. But
let me look at the Legos for a second.
Yeah. This is supposed to be like the seminal moment in foundations. Anyway, but back to, so we had broached this topic earlier about mathematics, how it's more productive, maybe more convenient to work with a certain framework, because there is a lot of progress to be made, even though the foundational questions are still up in the air.
Right.
Now in morality, clearly this foundational question, maybe I'll give you 5 minutes with the Lego. Maybe you solve it now. Maybe it's open-ended by the end. But can you make the same case that with morality, maybe it's just productive to pick the best, or I guess the most reasonable framework at the moment and try to make progress with it? Or do you think in the case of morality, it is imperative that we solve this foundational question first, and then we can take the bottom-up approach that we spoke about earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you want to hear distinguish morality from other normative areas. So it's clearly useful to have norms that kind of don't have any, like driving on the right side of the road rather than the left side or something. It's not like there's some deep principle justifying that, but what's justified is having a norm one way or the other. Yeah. So when it comes to norms generally, I think very often it's useful to just settle on some norms like we do, I think, roughly speaking, in the math case. That's an overstatement, especially because of the thing about arithmetic that I said. I don't think arithmetic is just, random. But when it comes to debates about fundamental value, like, what kind of life is worth living, what to care about, and now I'm using, notice the language of not factual language. I'm using the what to do language, what to do, well, who cares what follows from what, right? I mean, like, we just want to know what to do. We got one life, and hopefully, we do something that stands up to at least our own reflective criticism.
Sure.
And, so I think it's important that doesn't exit the realm of philosophy, the realm of scrutiny and debate. And you'll notice it hasn't. I think it's very interesting. I mean, if you just reflect on, you could imagine ethics having gone the same way as math. Like we just settle on some ethical principles and then we prove theorems from those principles. One could certainly do that. And some people have done that. And, you know, people in the effective altruism community, in a sense, have done that. They've settled on some principles about what we ought to do. And then they try to figure out, okay, now what will do this? What will maximize utility?
Religion as well.
Yeah, good point. Religion is another example. If it's sufficiently regimented and clear and, you know, one's beliefs, it does that. But I think it's quite striking and interesting that at least in the modern and era in the 20th century and 21st century, there doesn't seem to be much enthusiasm for that, right? We want to keep the debates going. We don't just want to settle conventionally on an answer and then move on to other things. So I think that says something deep about what it is to be human. Like for some reason, we're not content when it comes to fundamentally what to do, like what to do with my life, what to value, what to care about. I'm not content to just sort of defer. It needs to stand up to reflective scrutiny. I am content for most purposes to just defer that, okay, I'm going to be assuming the axiom of choice. So anyway, the answer in my view is that when you're talking about norms generally, it very often is useful to just settle on some norms, like driving on the right side of the road without justification, except that it's useful to have a norm.
Yeah.
But when you're talking about the most basic values, I think there's something deeply antithetical to, you know, how we conceive of ourselves in doing that. And I think that's good. I don't think we should do that.
Do you think because there's such a big question mark on these deep values, on the fundamental values, it's just a lot easier for a simple man like me to just latch onto like an existing framework of what fundamental values?
Stop disparaging yourself all the time. What do you mean by easier? Because I kind of think there's two senses, but go ahead.
As a simple man, and I mean it, it's so hard for me to like break down and enter the zone of self-reflection that I'm just going to pick out what are the existing frameworks of values. Religion offers many of them.
Right.
Maybe, I guess there are other forms apart from religion. And I'm just going to pick the one that I intuitively agree with the most and just use that for the rest of my life and try to defend it. Do you think that, I guess the question is this what's happening in the world at the moment? Because the question that you have raised up is such a tough question to answer. And like, it might take years of research that fall now. People are just latching onto a framework that they think is the most productive and convenient. And that's where we are. But once you solve this question, I guess this would be the theory of everything in terms of morality.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you said something really interesting though, because I don't think that what you said quite conforms to the lowly characterization you gave of yourself and the way you think about it. You said you're going to latch on to what intuitively strikes you as right and spend your life defending it.
Yeah.
I think that's very interesting that we feel the need to defend our moral views. We don't have to. We could just adopt some moral view and then shut up. And you know, lots of other people have other views, but who cares? But somehow we feel threatened by the other views.
Yep.
And that, I think, you know, betrays the fact that even if we sort of aren't all in, we do really want something that stands up to critical scrutiny from our own perspective. The defense is for us, not for them, I think often. We want to assure ourselves that they're wrong because it would be a real bummer if we were wrong. Now, why would it be such a bummer if it were just kind of a matter of driving on the right side or the left side of the street? So I think that shows that, yeah, we can have a sort of false consciousness about this. I think most of us do. I think most of us sort of have one foot in and one foot out of the reflection process. But it's very hard to pull yourself completely out. It's very hard to just, I mean, it's not even clear exactly what it would mean to not care what to value. I mean, you could have the value anything, but you can always then assess that value and you want to make sure that stands up to scrutiny. So,
yeah.
So, yeah, I think you're not as simple as you say you are.
That's the conclusion.
That's the conclusion.
I was looking for the ultimate answer about what I should value.
Oh, I'll email it to you.
I'll be waiting. Okay. I'm going to pivot slightly because we have gotten deep into all these questions about value. And I want to get to a question about the future for a bit. Let's talk about AI.
Yeah.
In 1977, computers entered the world of mathematics. The four-color theorem was one of the first major theorems that was solved with the assistance of a computer. Yeah. And since then, computers have just taken over computations, calculations, data analysis. Artificial intelligence is now becoming this giant elephant in the room of many different professions. How do you envision your field, the foundations of mathematics or analytic philosophy, changing or evolving with artificial intelligence? Would that happen? How would AI fit in? Do you think it's possible that AI can derive mathematical proofs and not just derive them, but also rank them, like separate the wheat from the chaff?
Mm-hmm.
And how do you envision the role humans will start playing this dynamic hybrid relationship in the future?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and it's obviously so open-ended as to it's hard to know where to start. Let me say, first of all, what I think is good for philosophy about this AI revolution. So, I've mentioned it a few times, like foundations of physics issues and stuff, and how it's been relegated mostly to philosophy departments. I say relegated because I think many physicists, at least, have a sort of lowly opinion of anything philosophical, and
it's too abstract. It's not practical.
Who knows? I don't. I think that
that's their comments, not mine.
Yeah. Maybe that's right. I don't know. I mean, and I also don't want to. There's plenty of physicists who are very interested in it and stuff. So I don't want to make it sound like 9 out of 10 would say that or something. But maybe a significant minority. But in recent years, technology has brought foundational questions more to the forefront. Namely, quantum computing has made questions about, one thing I'm struck by, I'm no physicist, but, I like reading physics books, and you never used to, in the physics books from the 70s, there never used to be much focus on things like the Bell inequalities or any of the action at a distance, entanglement stuff. That was kind of a specialized topic. It was solving the Schrodinger equation.
Yep.
And that's always in the books now. And in fact, I mean, in my experience, the new books, and in fact, a lot of books are just on what amounts to really simple quantum mechanics, because it's really quantum computing, but it's all about entanglement, So there was I think a practical pressure to start looking at these theorems, and you can't look at the Bell inequality very long and not think about foundations of quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
So now I think that, foundational issues are ingratiating themselves, forcing themselves, maybe is the more appropriate term, into physics proper in a way that they just didn't have to for the practically minded physicist in the 70s. I think there's something similar going on with the AI stuff and foundations of math. So of course, those who follow this stuff will know that, math and philosophy were deeply engaged at the turn of the 20th century. And as we've been talking about Russell, for example, he was a philosopher by training, and and of course Gödel was 1 foot in philosophy, 1 foot in math, and Hilbert, maybe the last great universal mathematician, was deeply involved with philosophical questions and programs, and something called Hilbert's program was among them. He's the famous guy he's the guy who gave the list of problems for the 20th century, and the first on the list was solve the continuum hypothesis, and then the logicians showed that you can't prove it and you can't refute it, and then the 10th, I think, was come up with an algorithm for solving Diophantine equations, and then the philosopher Putnam, Julia Robinson, and some other people proved that there is no algorithm for that. So anyway, the thing that I think is going to force mathematicians once again, force is too strong. I think the thing that's going to interest mathematicians once again in philosophical questions comes directly from this technology. And here's the issue. The issue is, okay, so one question is immediate, and it comes from reflection on the four-color case, which is, what is a proof? You know, you didn't have to worry about that for much of the 20th century. There was a view in the background that if you really wanted to get to the bottom of it, you'd go to the philosophy department and ask the logicians, and they'd tell you, well, a proof is something that could in principle be formalized in something called first order ZFC, maybe with identity, you know, blah, 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 with first order logic with identity, blah, 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 blah. And if there's a surrogate proof like that, then in principle, a machine could check that that was a valid proof and tell you after a finite number of steps, like a Turing machine could check. And that's what a proof is. But of course, you don't generally need to know that, because, you know, the way proofs are checked in math is you send it to an expert and you send it to another expert. And if there's enough agreement, a thumbs up. It's very rare for there to be a case where it doesn't end there. There is a case like that right now with the ABC conjecture, but it's very rare for that. So, you know, there was an answer that the philosophers came up with at the turn of the 20th century to what is a proof. And, you know, most people didn't need to know it because you don't really need to answer that question almost ever. Okay, but now we're programming computers to check proofs, to generate proofs, to assist in proving. So there's the question how to program it. Well, you can't very well decide that without taking a stand on the question of what axioms are true, what logic is correct, what does that mean?
Yeah.
So for example, I mean, some of these, my understanding is that one of the most popular theorem provers, or at least maybe it's a theorem checker, I can't remember, uses intuitionistic logic, which is a non-classical logic. Where the law of the excluded middle is not valid. So what does that mean? Does that mean like if Google gets a monopoly and they use a proof generator with intuitionistic logic, does that mean intuitionistic logic is the true logic of the world? Of course not. So there's no way of avoiding any longer the questions of, it's kind of like if you were to, you know, with self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. And you program, like, you know, what to do to maximize utility in this circumstance, or what, you know, what's the right thing to do in this contingency. There's just no avoiding taking a stand on that question. And presumably you want to have some sense of what the hell you're doing when you take a stand on that. You don't want to arbitrarily stipulate an answer. You want to get the right answer, it feels like. Yeah. Okay, what does it mean to get the right answer? We have, you know, we've been talking about what that could mean in the ethical case, but what does it mean in the mathematical case? Is it like physics, where most people think that whether there are gravitons is not the kind of question that is a matter of convention? Or is it, you know, like the, say, case of whether to put your fork on the left side of your plate, you know, is it, or drive on the right side of the road, where, you know, it's a norm, but there's no deep answer to who's really right. So, So what are the questions that come up now that I think that there's going to be no avoiding among the mathematical community generally? What's a proof? That question has been with us since, as you say, the proof of the four-color theorem, where ineliminable use was made to check zillions of cases and stuff. But you know, I'll give you an example from logic that sorry, let me finish that thought. Okay, so what is a proof? What does it mean to say that one system of proof is correct? What axioms are true and or correct, and what does that mean? And who decides? Like, how do we figure this out? Like, what's the methodology? Do we take a poll? Do we leave it to the richest IT company? So this is, I think, going to be unavoidable. But let me give you an example of how I think the terrain is changing. So, right, you got this four-color theorem proof, and there's, you know, the Kepler conjecture was another case. There aren't, though, that many cases where you had something that the mathematical community had to finally say, okay, I mean, it's a proof. I don't like it, but it's a proof, but I can't survey it, you know, but it's very likely, if you're asking about what's more likely to be true, you know, the four-color theorem has probably undergone dramatically more scrutiny than a typical proof in a mathematics journal that's just a few human beings specializing in that area saying, yeah, it looks okay. Yeah. So in terms of if a proof is just making something very likely to be true, or more carefully, making it very likely that it follows from the relevant axioms, the four-color theorem, the Kepler conjecture, these things have certainly been proved, but there haven't been that many cases where you just had to defer to a computer like that. But I think things are changing. So I'll give you an example from as I say, the Baroque area of logic, but speaking of its unusual status, I think that this might actually affect the status of the subject of the proof. So the philosopher W.V. Quine famously came up with an alternative set theory in the 30s. So, we were talking about the status of set theory. Is there a pie in the sky answer to the question, what are the true axioms of math? And I think, to be frank, if you asked 5 different mathematicians, you'd get 5 different answers. But if you were asked instead the question, what are the axioms of math? They would probably say the ZFC axioms, and maybe they'd know what they are, maybe they wouldn't, but whatever. Okay. So I was illustrating how, I think that there's a lot of contingency that the ZFC axioms were adopted as the axioms, and that there are lots of alternatives that one can entertain. And when you think about them, it's hard to see how there could be like one true fact about what are the axioms of math. Well, a great illustration of this is Quine came up with a system, and it attracted a lot. It's called New Foundations for Mathematical Logic. It attracted a lot of attention in the mid-20th century by some of the best logicians in the world. Rosser, in fact, who is the guy who cleaned up Gödel's proof. Gödel's proof originally was if the Peano arithmetic is consistent, it can't prove the Gödel sentence. And if it's omega consistent, it can't prove the negation. Rosser showed there's actually a way to make this. If it's consistent, can't prove the Gödel sentence, or Rosser sentence. And if it's consistent, merely consistent, it can't prove the negation either. Mathematical Logic book was written based on Quine's theory. Jensen did a really interesting proof of the consistency of the theory with what's called Euro elements, blah, blah, blah. I won't go through the details. The point is, the question of its consistency, New Foundations as it stands, remained open. And normally these questions, it's, to answer a consistency result means showing that it's consistent if something else is that we're confident in. So they're called relative consistency results. And people tried and tried and tried. And they could not find a consistency result. And also, the intended model of New Foundations is like not clear. It's not clear kind of what it's about, what it's saying. So people started thinking, I bet this is inconsistent, and it went way out of style. So by the time we're talking now, I mean, by the 70s even, it was like certainly in the realm of set theory, nobody worked with New Foundations. And by the time it was, by the time I was a grad student, it was almost like, you'd get like it was kind of embarrassing if you had interest in New Foundations, like no set theorist in New Foundations, that kind of thing. Well, long story short, there's this guy, Randall Holmes, at Boise State University. And for 10 years or more, maybe, he's felt like he has a proof that it's consistent. And there's only now, these days, there's like, a handful of experts in the world who work on New Foundations. He's one of them. Another one is Thomas Forster at Cambridge University. And Thomas Forster hired some graduate students to try to check this proof. Long story short, as I understand it, they couldn't tell. They couldn't tell whether it's like, that was the response he kept getting. I can't follow it, to be honest. Well, latest news, as I understand it, is, and this is right off the press. So as far as I know, this is, it would need to be confirmed, but I mean, I have confidence that this is the case. A group of graduate students, or maybe one grad students in tandem with Randall Holmes, got a computer to check it. They broke it down into such basic steps that a computer can follow the steps one by one. And it's a valid proof. So New Foundations is consistent. And all those people who have been, ignoring it for 50 years, because surely if it were consistent, they would have found a consistency proof, are wrong. And yet no one can follow the proof except Randall Holmes. So the reason if we end up believing this proof is valid will be because some machine told us. Randall and his machine tells us. And by his machine, I mean a machine we all trust for independent reasons. So we're entering a realm where it's not, I think, going to be super rare that you have a situation where your trust in the theorem primarily stems from your trust in a machine and a program, and you don't understand the proof in the way that we've, since Plato, become accustomed to understanding proof, sort of seeing it all at once, getting the gestalt. You know, you can make an argument to yourself that it must be true, but it, you know, will inevitably involve something like, you know, the machine is trustworthy and it's programmed this way and it says that. So it's got to be true.
I forget what his name was, but there was a science critic who wrote about this, the death of science as we know it.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Or something similar, where he made the case that we've reached the absolute threshold of our understanding or intuition about proofs and about science. And now anything beyond this point has to involve the help of some hybrid AI system. Yeah. Like we've reached the final limit of human knowledge, and anything beyond this, like we need to get help.
Yeah.
And you are ascribing to this viewpoint, I'm assuming.
Well, what I think is there's different projects one can have. And for some projects, this AI stuff is kind of irrelevant. So my colleague, Michael Harris, for example, is big on the Plato view, that the point of proof is understanding. And I say the Plato view because in the Meno, there's a famous sort of discussion of proof. And, you know, it's as maybe we'll talk about, it's a fascinating and puzzling question why the Greeks cared about proof. Like why did Euclid write his book that way? You know, and of course there was a compendium of known results, but one project, you know, you could just have the project of understanding, right? And if that's your project, then it doesn't matter what a computer proves. You want to understand things, and it might go way beyond what you can understand. And in that case, those aren't proofs in the sense you care about. But if instead your question is what follows from what, or what in the lingo, I mean, in the day job would be just what is true. Is it true that there are infinitely many prime numbers? Because they're not thinking, you know, deeply about things like axioms and blah, blah, blah. Well, then you know, it's hard to deny that pretty soon automated theorem provers, automated theorem checkers, and so on are going to be indispensable parts of the process. And you asked, you know, will they be able to do things like check for interestingness? Why not? In principle, it seems to me that it will be. I mean, you know, whenever somebody says, I think it wasn't that long ago that, you know, when these things came on the scene, somebody was like, well, they'll never do philosophy. I wish that were, of course, I've got tenure, so, you know, but I mean, why not? I bet they will. But that comes back to the issue of what's the point, right? Yeah. And philosophy, especially, you might think the point is understanding. So it can churn out phone books full of great wisdom, but if we can't understand it, it's not actually doing what we seek in philosophy. But this is just like the debate in the math case.
I guess at the core of philosophy is our understanding of it.
Yeah.
And you're describing a dystopian world where if you watch 2001: A Space Odyssey, relying on the machine seems pretty dangerous to me.
Yeah.
Okay. You open up this can of worms about the Greeks caring about mathematical proofs. So now we have to go there as our final big question.
Sure.
One of the courses you teach at Columbia is titled What is Mathematics?, where you explore these similarities or differences between different forms of mathematics. Mm-hmm. So the mathematics employed by the Egyptians, the Greek, the Indian, Chinese scholars, and of course, modern mathematics. I'm going to commit the cardinal sin of asking you to summarize an entire college course in one answer. But what are some of the glaring similarities or differences you have noticed? Of course, we spoke about mathematical proofs. The Greeks used it. Probably the Indians and Chinese scholars did not use it. What are these differences, common threads that you've seen, and how does that change the type of mathematics they use?
Yeah, good. I mean, so first of all, I should just clarify this. It's not a class I regularly teach. It was a seminar that my colleague, Chaim Geifman, who's a logician, actually, wanted to teach together, and it was really fun. And right, it was historically based, which is not so usual in philosophy of math or foundations of math. I mean, one criticism you could have of it is that it's ahistorical. And if you're really asking questions like what is math and stuff, you should be thinking about the history, not just, working in some particular system of logic and then proving theorems or something. So I'm no historian, and I found it fascinating to begin to learn about that stuff. And I've been really interested since. I'm so glad that I did, because there's a remarkable amount of contingency in things to do with math that I did not appreciate. And I was coming from a place of thinking that math is quite contingent. So I'm talking about extra kinds of contingency, right? So the most glaring is simply the idea that math has anything to do with proof. I mean, if that, I thought that was true by definition. Yeah. Like, what is math? It's where you prove things. I don't know. And of course, I knew that, like, very, very basic math about counting pebbles or something doesn't involve proof, but any established mathematical tradition would involve proof. And as the historians will tell you, that's definitely not the case. In fact, it's kind of a anomaly and requires explanation, that people have tried to offer explanations in terms of actually Athens being a democracy and requiring like evidence and argument and stuff like this. But why did the Greeks care about proving things? Why didn't they just want to know what was the case? Right? Like, why don't you just want to know whether the Pythagorean theorem is true? Who cares about a proof of it? And there are two main answers to that, I think, in the literature, and they correspond actually to the two kinds of values you could have in light of this AI stuff. One is you want understanding, and proofs facilitate understanding. They answer the question why. Notice that is like the Michael Harris view, where the AI stuff, if it doesn't answer why and I can't understand it, it's irrelevant. Yep. The other is certifying or making certain the claim. So I want to know, I don't just want to think it's probable or likely or it seems plausible. I want to certify. That the AI stuff might do. But of course it might do even though you don't understand. So anyway, so there's different accounts of why the Greeks did what they did, but they were unusual in this way, and not just unusual in the sense that, so for example, the Indians had very advanced mathematics that wasn't proof oriented in the same sense. Yep. Chinese had very advanced mathematics that wasn't proof oriented in the same sense. The Mayans had advanced mathematics in certain respects that, that's just, wildly different in some ways. But it's not just that, it's that the Westerners themselves, right? Like before the Greeks didn't have proof. Like, try doing anything interesting with Roman numerals, right? So immediately after also they didn't have, the proof was not a value of great significance. But before, in the Mediterranean, the Mesopotamians, incredible when you think about how early they're doing what they're doing. Just incredible. But proof was not central, even when kind of recreational math was. So it wasn't just practical either. They were doing recreational math. But so anyway, and then, in medieval Europe, proof was no longer central. Newton lamented that his Principia Mathematica doesn't follow the method of the ancients exactly, and so forth. So and this is an example of where, math and physics became so entwined, and actually you could say that physics was leading to the new math, and it was only math later that was catching up and making rigorous things and so forth. But we only picked up that thread in the 19th century, really. So you have this idea of rigor, and I should just highlight again, I'm no historian. I'm sure there's some historian knows the answer to this, but I should highlight the awkwardness of the following situation. Aristotle invented logic. We then have in the West, and then we have Euclid's Elements. Euclid's Elements is not rigorous by the standards of what was thought to be logic. So that's another thing that's weird. Proof, whatever it is in the Greeks, is not what we now think of, which is following logically according to our notion of logic. So anyway, it was only in the 19th century that this idea of, this obsession with proof, I think, reemerged, and people like Dedekind and Peano and Russell and Frege and so forth. And in the 19th century and in the 20th century, it developed even further. But that's a dramatic contingency in my view. I mean, it's not a contingency about the content. So it's not an example of a case where like the Mesopotamians thought there weren't infinitely many prime numbers, and or let's say the Chinese thought there weren't infinitely many prime numbers, and the Greeks thought there was. But it's a case where something so essential, it seems like, to math is actually the exception historically. It's not just not universal, it's the exception. So whatever math is, if we're actually trying to do justice to the historical record, it's not proof. And I think that this, this is again a kind of live question. Why care about proof, especially now with the AI stuff? So anyway, that's the main contingency that I noticed. But I mean, there's lots of other things one can talk about when thinking about the history of math and how it relates to the philosophy of math. So
interesting that we spent the last couple of hours talking about the importance of proofs, and now we're talking about whether proofs need to exist or not.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, everything's been a lie.
Yeah, trust me.
I'm trying.
Okay, please.
It's a lot. Like, it's like you offer the red pill or the blue pill, right? And this has been that day for me. Okay. I have to be mindful of your time. So we're going to start moving to our closing questions. But before we go there, I would love it if you can interpret what masterpieces I've built with the Lego.
Oh, that's what you were doing. Okay. I'm supposed to interpret.
Yeah. What do you think this is?
An Easter basket.
Which one? Both of them?
I have no idea. You got to give me, I
wasn't building anything in particular. So what does it look like to you?
I mean, these sort of look like stairs. This looks like something you could walk through.
Yeah, you'll have to define what walking through now.
Yeah. No.
To define the axioms of what is beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. This is beauty.
But then define the... No,
okay. That's fair.
Yeah. You've broken my entire world. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It's incredible that I'm holding you responsible for like breaking down all the assumptions I had about life. Okay. Let's move into some of our closing questions.
Sure.
What are some books, movies, role models that have strongly influenced you in your life?
Yeah. Okay. So... Yeah. So one thing that's, I don't know if this is a bad form or something. I don't really have many role models, I would say. Like, there wasn't any philosopher that I wanted to be like. I've come to really appreciate some philosophers, but that's not how I got into it. There are certainly lots of people I respect, innumerable people I respect, but I don't know that that I really think of it that way. It's sort of post facto. I look back and notice that, I'm really impressed by this or that. So intellectually, for example, I'm glad that you've quoted Russell so much. I mean, I think that he's really up there with people like Descartes and Leibniz and so forth. And it's funny because sometimes philosophers like to rank each other. What's the best philosopher of the 20th century or something? He doesn't do that well. And I have to think it's just because people can't like swallow everything that he's done. He's just done so much more than, the typical philosopher. So they like read, like his book on matter and consciousness or whatever, analysis of matter. And then they compare it to something, on the same subject. But I mean, he just contributed to everything basically, with very few exceptions, and I just think he was such an open mind in a way that philosophers should be. I've heard that he was a bad guy. I have no idea. I won't take a stand on that. I also have really appreciated Quine, but only post facto. Initially, he really annoyed me. But I think he's a truly great philosopher, a system builder, you know, who will be reading for a long time. So yeah, you know, Carnap, I actually, I've come to respect, but still I don't really enjoy his work. But he's a really, I think, impressive philosopher. Okay, so yeah, books.
And they don't have to be philosophy as well.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
could be just any books that influence.
Okay, well, so I think I mentioned maybe at the end when you were asking me how I got into Indian philosophy. I think the first book I ever read was The Three Pillars of Zen,
Yeah.
by Richard Kapleau. And you know, these days when I look back at it, I'm like, but I would want to mention something in the realm of Buddhist philosophy. And thankfully that term is no longer a misnomer. There's like, you know, we have someone in our department who specializes in Buddhist philosophy. And so there's a lot of great writing that's really at the intersection of contemporary analytic philosophy and Buddhist thought. And I think I won't take the risk of recommending one thing over another on that, but there's some people, you know, Janardhan Ganari is one of the, I think, recent pioneers of this. There's some people doing really great work that's speaking to those perennial questions that got me interested anyway in Indian philosophy, but is connecting up with a contemporary worldview so that it doesn't feel like this is just of historical interest or something. So something in that department, and I won't name. There was another question.
Movies.
Oh, movies. Yeah, you know, that's so with both movies and music, I'm well, in the case of movies, I'm mostly picky about the acting, and in cases of music, I guess I'm picky about everything. But so I'm really hard to please, and I'm much better at complaining. So I'll say this, which won't be news to anyone who watches movies. I really like Daniel Day-Lewis. I think Christian Bale is getting better all the time, and now is in the same discussion sometimes.
Okay.
Not in all of his movies. He does more. I mean, he does a lot more. I thought that There Will Be Blood was both a great movie, but also a great example of Daniel Day-Lewis's range, and Phantom Thread.
Yeah.
And also the soundtrack of that's pretty good. Let's see. I don't know. Again, I think it'd be kind of disingenuous. I don't really have favorite movies, so I have a lot of complaints.
Yeah. Okay.
About details.
Add that in the email that you'll send me when you finally solve the philosophical questions. What is the most powerful idea in 1, mathematics, and 2, ethics, according to you? Or the most powerful question?
So the most powerful idea in math, but the problem is turning it into something clear. But that problem, I think, is enormously productive, is structure. I think that's the most powerful idea. What is structure?
Yeah.
I don't think we have a settled answer, but it's a very productive project to try to sort of answer and investigate that. It's the most powerful question or idea in ethics. Yeah, I might say, I think, you know, there's this, just like Gibbard, I try to frame the project of deliberation about the world as all bottoming out in a simple question, which is what to do. And I guess I would say that I think that is the true north of ethics. I mean, fundamentally, you can talk about what's good and what's obligatory, and, you know, who's right or wrong and blah, blah, blah. at the end of the day, what to do, how to live, what to care about, which are all questions of action.
Well, I was hoping before this interview that we'll have an AI system that'll just crank out the answer.
Yeah,
like the Hitchhiker's Guide.
We'll do that. Yeah.
But you're saying that even that has to be like, it's biased on the domain you define for it. Anyway, my world is broken.
Yes.
Okay. Bertrand Russell had once said that 3 passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life. The longing for love, the search for knowledge, and the unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind. What passions do you think have governed your life and your work?
So I think a passion to find my authentic self or for authenticity has been powerful. I think like most people in intellectual fields, a passion to understand has been powerful. And I think a passion for connection, which is, again, completely not unique. But like Russell, I think, wrote, that passion can transcend just, connection with other humans and animals and so forth. I mean, I think there's a kind of connection one feels with their subject if they pursue it deeply enough. And this kind of, language is used sometimes by mathematicians, but I mean, I don't think it's unique to math. One wants to feel connected if one's seeking understanding to the world, and understanding is a kind of connection. It's we hope that our representation of the world is latching onto the world.
Yeah,
and so that's definitely an inspiration. And of course, there's a million worries you can have about whether that's possible, or you can know you've done it, and blah blah blah. But it's I think it's telling, not of me, of humanity, that is very hard to just let that go. Kind of like the question of, what to value, and just to stipulate some value. It's very hard to just be like, who cares if I'm getting it right? So that's a guiding force, even if, never make any dramatic progress.
In that spirit, then what would you like your legacy to be?
Well, I don't think about that. And you know what? I don't think I want to think about that. I don't really care. It's not that I don't care about what I do. It's not that I don't care about what, about the things that I'm focused on in my life. It's that I don't care how it sort of ages. Like if I did something stupid and everybody thought it was great for millennia, like, who cares? Meanwhile, if I did something that I really could feel good about myself and everybody forgot, I'm happy, So legacy is not something that interests me. I mean, because legacy has to do with the perception of others on your own work. And I'd just much rather be self-satisfied in the not bad sense of that term. I just rather feel comfortable in my own work and not worry about what anybody else thinks about it.
What type of legacy would leave you self-satisfied?
Well, again, I mean, what would leave me satisfied is what I actually do, and what my legacy is a function of both what I do and how people respond to it. Sure. And I have no control over the second, and don't really care that much about the second. But what I actually do, what matters to me is, I think, following my authentic sense of self, and that means pursuing projects that really interest me rather than what I think will get more attention or is trendy at the moment and so forth. And it also, it involves being, a husband to my wife in the way that I think is what she deserves and so on. So yeah, I think integrity matters to me. Legacy, I don't really care about.
Final question.
Yeah.
We've spent the last couple of hours talking about the true nature of things. We spoke about fundamental value.
Right.
So I'm going to ask you the easiest question possible. What is the meaning of life?
Oh,
Just
goody.
in Clarke-Doane.
Oh, goody. Yeah. So this is where my mysticism is going to come in.
Okay.
You know,
Love it.
I mean, at heart, I'm a mystic. And what that means for me is that I think that language is inadequate at the end of the day. That doesn't mean that I don't think it has any role. In fact, I think language is essential to sort of, you know, as a ladder. But at the end of the day, and this is nothing new, as early as I've had any remotely philosophical thought, you know, I've been inclined towards the view that kind of language at the end of the day doesn't make much sense. And questions in particular, like what's the meaning of life, I think are the kind of question that don't get a chalkboard response. That there's not a response that you can write on the chalkboard that does justice to that question. And yet, I don't think it's confused. I don't think that, you know, oh, that's silly. Isn't that cute? I don't think it's like to give to charity, even though you should give to charity. I think it's a deep and important motivating question in philosophy for me too. And after that, I pass.
Do you not have like the closest abstraction in language that you can share today?
No, I have nothing to say.
What do you know that I don't know?
A lot. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then we leave it on that element of mystery. Professor, if people want to connect with you, find out more about your work, get one of your books, where can they go? Where can they find you?
I think I'm on the internet. So no, the Columbia Philosophy Department's website has websites for all of us. And I also have a homepage that you can get to from that. And I think you can download almost all my papers and one of the, depending on what library you're accessing, one of my books you can download. I don't know whether you can download both, but they're both cheap now because there's now a paperback version of the expensive one.
Highly recommended. Professor, thank you for a fantastic
Thanks so much for having me.